Hi, my name's Hannah Hobbs, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about making assessment meaningful, specifically for ESL students. So, the first thing that you would want to consider is if the assessment is fair, valid, useful, and reliable. So, the fairness of an assessment is based on considering the needs of the students who are taking the assessment. So if the assessment isn't fair and bias will come into play, which makes it unfair and unable to be used. The validity of an assessment is determined by whether or not the means of the assessment match the purpose of the assessment. So, for example, if you were trying to assess whether a student knows their multiplication, you wouldn't assess that student on their spelling during that test because that would make the assessment invalid. The usefulness of an assessment is judged on how well the assessment serves the person who's taking it. So it has to be worth the cost of their time, effort, and money. And last but not least, reliability refers to whether or not the assessment is consistent. And this mostly falls back on the scorer of the assessment. So if a scorer discounts one student for not using complete sentences, they should do the same to the next student in order to make that assessment reliable. So when we go about actually planning out our instruction and assessment, the first thing that, and I don't think you can see this graphic, but the first thing that you would need to do is set goals and priorities. And then you would need to translate those goals into measurable objectives. Then you would design your assessment, make sure that it's fair, reliable, and useful. Then you would actually do the activity with the kids and conduct the assessment. And then you would evaluate your findings based on the assessment. Then you would self-assess as an educator to see what you could improve on, what your students need to improve on. One thing that we as educators need to remember is that not all assessment means test or quiz. And this is especially true for English language learners. If we're constantly assessing on paper and pencil, we're relying on one means of how a student performs. It's not seeing the student as a whole person. It's seeing how they can perform on paper. So we want to know how they perform in general. How is their progress in a certain area? So this chart is about assessment types, and it shows that there's a diagnostic, formative, summative, interim, criterion reference, and norm reference type of assessments. So a diagnostic is like a quick check. And usually this is done before instruction, so we're checking that prior knowledge. This is especially important with ESL students because their prior knowledge is going to be greatly different from someone who is a native English speaker, because obviously we've all had unique experiences, and especially our diverse ESL learners. The norm reference test refers to state testing, which is something that's obviously out of the mainstream teacher's control. A formative assessment is assessing during instruction. So it might be that quick discussion question. It might even be taking anecdotal notes of a conversation between peers. It could be a checklist. Then we have a summative assessment, and something that educators seem to do often is link summative to a comprehensive test, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be a one-on-one interview. It could be a student-selected project. And then we also have our benchmark assessments, and these benchmark assessments are more at the end of a grading period. So a good way to do this and to show progress is just to track students' progress on each assessment that you use and use that for your benchmark assessment to kind of give a checkup on how the student's doing so they can gauge their strengths and weaknesses, and so that you can too as their teacher. And this next chart is different assessment types. So it's kind of breaking down what we just talked about. So when we talk about formative assessment, what does that specifically look like? So we can go to this chart and see that for formative assessment, we could use teacher observations, checklists, conversations, interviews. We could even use self-assessment from the students or their journals, reflection logs. And then we could also use extended projects, multiple choice items, obviously, and tasks with different answers being allowed. So not always, yes, you're right, no, you're wrong. And two, by providing different types of assessment and providing students with a chance to self-assess, and also providing students with assessments that don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer, we're leading the way for student-led instruction, which is more meaningful. So one thing in particular that we need to be really careful about that I kind of touched on earlier was when we're making real-life connections within our instruction, we need to make sure that we're considering all of our students and how they might have seen it before. So, for example, if I'm talking about multiplication and I relate it to, or if I'm talking about fractions, I relate it to pizza, which is a common thing to do. Well, some of our students who have come from other cultures might not fully grasp that, or they might grasp it but just not have a strong connection to it. So we need to make sure that we're considering all of our students, because when it comes to assessing them, they can pull that knowledge out and those connections that they made during instruction out to aid them in their assessment. Another thing that we can do to make assessment more meaningful is to describe to the students how they're being assessed before we assess them. So giving them a rubric at the beginning of the unit so that they know, well, when we have this teacher-led interview, these are the things that we need to do to achieve an A or to achieve mastery. And that way the students are prepared and they know what's expected of them. And then when you give results back as an educator, they can more clearly see their areas of improvement and their areas of strength. So I hope this little clip was valuable to you, and I know some of the charts were a little blurry, but you can find a wealth of information by putting in types of assessment into a search engine, and they have a valuable list, and they go on and on. And it's good to do that so that we can see different assessments that we might not have used yet. So I hope this was helpful to you.